I am 35 years old, and just days ago I buried my husband on the other side of the world. His name was James, and he was only 37 when he collapsed without warning. A brain aneurysm stole him from me in a foreign hospital room, leaving me to face the most harrowing days of my life, utterly alone. And when I say alone, I mean it in the truest sense. Not one person from my family stood by me when I lowered him into the earth in Singapore. Not my parents, not my brother, no one. Just me, a handful of his colleagues, and the crushing silence of grief that wrapped itself around my chest until I could hardly breathe. I had always believed I came from a family imperfect, as we were, that would rally in times of crisis. But I was wrong. Their absence that day, and in the days that followed, revealed something I had spent years refusing to admit, that I was, and perhaps had always been, disposable in their eyes. The aftershocks of that truth hit me harder than any earthquake. And it all came into sharp, undeniable focus the day I returned home, exhausted, broken, clinging to whatever strength I had left, and texted my family group chat, "Flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up?" The replies are burned into me like scars I'll never shed. My brother Troy. We are busy. Try Uber. My mother. Why didn't you plan better? As if grief had a schedule I could pencil neatly into their calendars. As if burying the man I loved required advance notice so as not to inconvenience their social lives. I remember staring at those words on my phone, numb, hollow, disbelieving. I typed back, "No worries." But inside, I collapsed. Because it wasn't just about a ride home, it was about everything. Every birthday they left early, every graduation they brushed aside, every moment of my life when their attention belonged somewhere else with someone else, usually my brother. James had seen it long before I was willing to. He used to tell me gently but firmly that we couldn't change them, but I could choose how much power they had over me. He'd squeeze my hand and remind me that my worth didn't depend on their recognition. But now that he was gone, those words felt like both a comfort and a torment. Because without him, who else would see me? I dragged my husband's belongings, his clothes, his watch, the books he loved across 30 hours of travel turbulence and sleepless nights, believing that once I reached home, maybe my family would finally rise to the moment. That maybe, just maybe, I'd arrive to someone waiting for me at the gate, arms outstretched, ready to carry even a fraction of my pain. But instead, I stood at baggage claim watching the carousel spin endlessly, surrounded by strangers reuniting joyfully, while I tried to wrestle 3 heavy suitcases by myself. One of them burst open, spilling James's clothes across the polished airport floor. I fell to my knees, frantically gathering them, my tears dripping onto the fabric that still smelled faintly of him. And not a single family member was there to see me breaking. It was an airport worker, a woman with kind eyes named Gloria, who knelt beside me and whispered, "Are you all right?" A stranger cared enough to ask what my own blood never had. She stayed with me until my rideshare came, even loading my luggage and squeezing my hand before I left. That brief touch carried more comfort than anything my parents or brother had offered in months. And in that moment, a terrible, liberating truth crystallized inside me. I had been begging for water from an empty well my entire life. But what I didn't know then, what I couldn't yet see, was that my homecoming would unravel into something darker, more dangerous, and far more public than I ever imagined. Within hours, my tragedy and my family's betrayal would spill out of the shadows and into the glare of the evening news. When I finally pulled up to my parents' house that evening, the driveway was packed. Cars lined the curb, lights blazed from every window, and laughter floated out into the night air. For a fleeting moment, I thought foolishly that maybe, just maybe, they had organized some kind of welcome home gathering. Not to celebrate, but to comfort, to acknowledge that I had survived something unbearable. My heart even dared to flicker with a fragile hope. But when I stepped inside, dragging James's heavy suitcase behind me, that hope shattered instantly. It wasn't for me. It never was. My brother Troy was home from a weekend getaway, and the family had gathered to celebrate him. He strutted around the living room, retelling some story about missing a connecting flight, his voice booming over the chatter. My mother laughed so hard she nearly spilled her wine. My father clapped him on the back, and not a single person even turned to acknowledge me standing in the doorway, exhausted, hollow-eyed, and carrying the ashes of the man I loved in my hand luggage. I stood there for what felt like an eternity before my mother finally looked over. "Oh, you're back," she said flatly, as if I'd just returned from running errands, not from burying my husband half a world away. She didn't hug me. She didn't ask how I was. Instead, she waved vaguely toward the dining table and said, "There's food in the kitchen if you're hungry." Something inside me snapped, then not with a scream, but with silence. I carried James's suitcase upstairs to my old room, the one they still kept like a museum of my teenage years, and closed the door. Alone, I sank to the floor, pressing my forehead to the carpet, trying not to choke on the rage and sorrow crashing through me. How could they be so blind, so cruel? Or maybe they weren't blind at all. Maybe they saw me perfectly and simply didn't care. That night, I lay awake in the same bed I'd slept in as a child, listening to the muffled laughter downstairs. My family celebrating while I silently broke apart. The cruelty of it wasn't just neglect, it was betrayal. And the betrayal dug deeper because I had known deep down that this was always who they were. James had known too. And now in his absence, the truth was so sharp it could have cut glass. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen to find my father reading the paper, my mother fussing with the coffee machine, Troy scrolling his phone. No one looked up when I entered. I poured myself a cup of coffee with shaking hands, the silence so thick it suffocated me. Then, without lifting his eyes from his phone, Troy said, "You should have told us sooner when the funeral was. Maybe we could have made it." I froze. My chest heaved. I turned to him, my voice cracking. "You knew. I texted you all. I begged you to come." He shrugged, still not looking at me. "We were busy." Something inside me broke open then. Years of swallowing, hurt, of shrinking myself to fit the space they allowed me, of pretending it didn't matter. I slammed the mug down so hard coffee splashed across the counter. "Busy. You were busy while I buried my husband alone. You were busy while I dragged his ashes through airports by myself." My voice shook, not just with anger but with grief so raw it tore at my throat. My father finally lowered his paper, his expression hard. "There's no need to dramatize. You're not the only one who lost something." The words hit me like a slap. Not the only one. I had lost my partner, my future, the only person who had ever truly seen me. What had they lost? A son-in-law they barely acknowledged. Their dismissiveness was worse than cruelty. It was erasure. I left the house that day and walked for hours, my phone buzzing with unanswered calls from friends who had seen my cryptic social media posts about James's death. I didn't want their pity. What I wanted was something I couldn't name yet: justice maybe, or vengeance, or simply recognition of the pain I carried. But as I wandered, I began to realize that what my family had done wasn't just emotional neglect. It was something that once revealed would shock more than just me. Because while I thought their betrayal ended with abandonment, I was wrong. What I didn't know then was that a far darker secret was buried beneath their coldness. And it was a secret that would tear our family open on live television, dragging every lie and wound into the light for the world to see. 2 days after my return, the story broke in a way I could never have anticipated. I had been too drained to notice the whispers, too caught up in my grief to connect the dots. But one careless conversation at my parents' dinner table spiraled into something public, something explosive. It started when Troy's friend, a local reporter, came over for drinks. I hadn't even realized who he was until I overheard my brother laughing with him in the living room. "You wouldn't believe it," Troy said, his voice carrying. "My sister had to bury her husband overseas. Alone. Can you imagine? Nobody even went with her. Brutal." There was a smirk in his tone, as though my devastation were a punchline. I froze in the hallway, my stomach lurching. The reporter chuckled but then asked, "Is that true? No one from your family went?" "Of course not," Troy replied. "We had things going on. She manages fine on her own." The casual cruelty of it burned me. But what happened next stunned even me. The reporter must have smelled a story, because by the next morning an article appeared online. The headline screamed at me from my phone screen: Widow, forced to bury husband abroad alone, family too busy to attend. Within hours, the story spread. Photos from James's memorial in Singapore surfaced pictures of me clutching the urn while strangers placed their hands on my shoulders in comfort. The image contrasted sharply with a family portrait someone had dug up from Troy's social media, him, my parents, all smiles at a barbecue the same weekend. My phone exploded. Calls, text messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. Strangers reached out with sympathy, with outrage, with disbelief. And then the news vans came. Reporters parked in front of my parents' house, microphones thrust at me as I tried to leave for the grocery store. How does it feel to be abandoned by your family in your darkest hour? They asked. Do you think this was intentional neglect? At first, I refused to answer. I kept my head down, cheeks burning with humiliation. But as the days wore on, as I watched my parents shut their curtains and Troy curse at cameras, something inside me shifted. For once, the world was seeing what I had always known, that my pain had been invisible to the people who should have cared most. One night, after another ambush by reporters, my mother cornered me in the hallway. Her voice was sharp, her eyes blazing. "You need to fix this," she hissed. "Tell them it's not true. Tell them we were supportive. This attention is ruining our lives." I stared at her, disbelief coursing through me. Ruining your lives. I buried my husband alone. Alone, Mom. And you want me to lie to protect your reputation? She flinched, but only for a moment before her mouth hardened into a line. Family's close ranks, we don't air dirty laundry. The words echoed in my mind long after she left the room. Families close ranks. But hadn't they closed ranks long ago? Just not around me. They had built a fortress of love and loyalty around Troy, leaving me in the cold. And now they wanted me to help patch the cracks in their wall. Not this time. The next day, when a reporter caught me outside with the inevitable question, "Do you have anything you want to say to your family?" I stopped. I looked straight into the camera, my heart pounding, my grief burning into something sharper, fiercer. "Yes," I said. My voice was steady, almost eerily calm. "I want to say that love shows itself in action, and when I needed my family most, they weren't there. I was left alone to carry a burden no one should have to carry. That's the truth, whether they like it or not." The clip aired that night on the evening news. It spread online, clipped and shared, my face framed by raw honesty and anguish. And as much as it terrified me, it also liberated me. For once I wasn't silenced. For once the world could see me. But the media frenzy was only the beginning. Because as the spotlight widened, old wounds and buried secrets began to surface. Secrets my family had spent decades hiding. And once they came to light, there would be no going back. The firestorm only grew. Within a week, our family name was everywhere. Articles, talk shows, even late-night comedians making jokes about the family too busy for a funeral. I should have felt humiliated, but instead I felt something sharper, like justice clawing its way through the years of silence I had endured. For once, their indifference wasn't hidden in shadows. For once, the world saw it for what it was. But what I didn't expect was how quickly the attention dug deeper. Strangers were curious, and reporters were relentless. They began asking questions about Troy, about why my parents had always favored him, about whispers of money mismanaged and debt swept under the rug. And then, one afternoon, a journalist shoved a folder into my hands outside the grocery store. "You should see this," she said. "It explains a lot." Inside were public records, things anyone could have found, but no one in the family had ever dared to. My brother had been arrested at 19 for drunk driving, his charges quietly dismissed after my father pulled strings. There was an old bankruptcy filing in my parents' name debts that had mysteriously vanished. And most damning of all, a lawsuit settlement paid out to a woman who had once worked for my father. The details were murky, but the implication was clear: silence bought scandal buried. I sat in my car staring at those documents, my hands shaking. Suddenly, my entire childhood made sense: the constant emphasis on protecting the family, the way every decision revolved around Troy, the demand for loyalty above truth. It wasn't just favoritism, it was survival. They had built a dynasty of lies and expected me to play along. And when I refused to fit the mold, they left me outside the walls. That night, I confronted my mother in the kitchen. She was washing dishes, her back stiff, when I laid the papers on the counter. "You knew," I said quietly. Her shoulders trembled, but she didn't turn around. "We did what we had to do. For the family. For Troy," I corrected. My voice was steady now, stronger. "You did it for him. And you've been doing it for him my entire life, covering up his mistakes, praising his every breath, sacrificing me on the altar of his failures." She spun around, her eyes flashing with anger and shame. "You don't understand. He's fragile. He couldn't survive the weight of his mistakes. You were always stronger. You could survive without us." The words gutted me even as they confirmed everything I had ever feared. They had abandoned me not because they didn't see me, but because they thought I didn't need them. They had mistaken endurance for invincibility, leaving me to weather storms alone while they coddled Troy in a glass bubble. I left the kitchen shaking, but I didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, I began to gather every record, every clipping, every proof of what had been hidden. If they wanted to cast me as the one airing dirty laundry, so be it. Maybe the world deserved to know. And the world did know sooner than I expected. One morning I woke to see my story trending online again, this time with a headline that made my blood run cold. "Family abandoned widow hides dark past of cover-ups and lies." The documents I had been collecting had somehow leaked. Whether the reporter who gave them to me had shared them or someone else had dug them up, I still don't know. But there it was, splashed across the news for everyone to see. My parents stopped leaving the house. Troy raged on social media, calling me a traitor, accusing me of ruining his life. But I stayed silent. For once, I didn't defend myself. I didn't rush to soften the blow or shield them from consequences. I let the world see what I had always known. And in that silence, I found power. The girl who had begged for love was gone. The woman who had buried her husband alone remained, and she was done begging. But the story wasn't finished, not yet. Because one more truth was waiting to surface, a secret so personal, so devastating, it would either break me completely or free me forever. It was a letter that delivered the final blow. A yellowing envelope tucked inside one of my father's old desk drawers, unearthed by accident when I was searching for something else. My name was scrawled across the front in my mother's handwriting, shaky but deliberate. For a moment I hesitated, heart pounding, afraid of what one more truth might do to me. But I opened it anyway. Inside was a confession that made my knees buckle. My mother wrote that when I was a child, she had made a choice to pour everything into Troy, to protect him at all costs because she feared he was too fragile for this world. She admitted that she had leaned on me, relied on me to be the strong one, the overlooked one, the child who needed less. But it went further than favoritism. She confessed that my father had wanted me sent to live with an aunt when I was 10, convinced that one less mouth to feed would save the family's finances during their bankruptcy. It was my mother who had insisted I stay, though her insistence came with conditions that I would never ask for too much, never demand more than what they could spare after Troy. Reading those words, I felt like the ground beneath me had cracked open. I wasn't just neglected, I had been deliberately chosen as the sacrifice. The quiet child, the survivor, the one they believed could endure the weight of their selfishness. My entire life had been shaped not by accident, but by design. I walked into the living room where my parents sat, the television muttering in the background, Troy sulking nearby with his phone. I held the letter out, my hands trembling, but my voice clear. "I know everything now." My father scoffed as though tired of the whole ordeal. "And what does it change? We did what we had to." But my mother couldn't meet my eyes. Her hands twisted in her lap, guilt written across every line of her face. And in that moment I realized the revenge I thought I wanted, the screaming, the exposing, the punishing, was already happening without me lifting another finger. The world had seen their truth. The shame they carried now was heavier than anything I could have inflicted. I turned to Troy, who finally looked up from his phone. His face was pale, strained, the arrogance drained away. For once, he looked small. I thought of James, of how he used to tell me that karma had its own way of working, that sometimes the best revenge was simply surviving long enough to see the scales balance. And I understood. I didn't need to destroy them. They were destroying themselves, so I left. I packed my bags, took James's ashes, and walked out of the house that had never truly been home. I found an apartment of my own, small but filled with light, and I built something new. Not perfect, not free of pain, but mine. I planted daffodils outside the window in memory of James, and each spring when they bloom, I feel him close again. I don't speak to my family anymore. Not out of hatred, but out of self-preservation. I've learned that love without respect is just control and family without compassion is just a cage. I am free now, not because they set me free, but because I chose to walk away. And if you're listening to my story tonight, maybe you know that feeling too. The ache of betrayal, the weight of being invisible in the eyes of the people who should have cherished you most. If that's you, hear me when I say this, you are not weak for walking away. You are strong for surviving. If my story touched you, please like this video, share it so others might feel less alone, and subscribe for more stories like mine. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to free yourself from the people you once called family? I'd like to hear your story too.